A hillside in northern Vermont, 3 miles from the Canadian line. Snow gone off the pastures, the ice still cracking on the ridge behind an old dairy barn. Then the barn. Cedar-sided 3 floors, a slate roof that has kept its rain for 100 years. Inside, a single lantern burning at 4 in the morning. A carpenter's pencil on the floor. Fingers that no longer close around it. Down at the county road, a set of headlights turns onto gravel. A dark blue Buick, polished for a room the driver has not yet entered. A rimless pair of glasses catching the dashboard glow. An aluminum clipboard on the seat beside him. He is not driving fast. He does not need to. Somewhere between the dying man in the lantern light and the man in the polished shoes coming up the drive, there is a granddaughter, 24 years old. She has not yet opened the drawer. The Boston dealer set the loop on its black cord and did not say a word for the space of 10 breaths. I counted them. 12 years later, I have still not stopped counting them. She was standing in the doorway of a Vermont hay barn in April, with the smell of cedar and cold iron rising off 700 butter churns, stacked 4 high on pallets. I had built myself out of pine slabs from Everett Ashby's woodlot. Silver gray hair pulled into a low twisted bun. Round tortoiseshell reading glasses pushed up on her head. Rust-colored wool coat cream turtleneck underneath black wide-leg trousers. Flat black boots that were about to be ruined and clearly did not care. Beatrix Ferndale. She had driven up from Boston in a Volvo that was the exact color of a stone that had sat in a river for a long time. She said one word. Oh, just that. One syllable low in her throat, the way you say a word when the word is not for the room, but for the small private place inside you, where you had been keeping a hope you were not sure you still owned. I was 24 years old that morning. I am 40 now, and I still remember the exact temperature of the light. I remember thinking before she said anything else that I had been waiting 3 years and 11 months for someone to make a sound in that barn that was not laughter. But that morning came later, long after everything I am going to tell you. To get to it, we have to go back 3 years and 11 months earlier. A Tuesday in March, 11 minutes past 4 in the morning. The phone rang in a farmhouse kitchen in Orleans County, Vermont. I picked it up on the second ring because I had already been awake for an hour, listening to the ice slide off the metal roof. The voice on the line was the Newport dispatcher. She said her name and asked me to sit down. I was already sitting. "I was in the barn," she said. "Ephraim, your grandfather." She used both words because she did not know which one was going to reach the person on the other end of the line. He was found by Everett Ashby, who had come over to borrow a hoop bender at 5. I said, "All right." She said the sheriff was still there and she was so sorry. I said, "All right." I said, "Because that is what you say. Because if you say anything else in that first minute, you begin to break something you cannot afterward put back together. Because when your grandfather has raised you with a pencil in his hand for 10 years, you learn to speak the way a pencil sounds." I put on the olive green barn coat that had been his before it was mine, laced the brown boots with the rust orange laces that were his too, and I walked across the yard in the black wet cold of a Vermont March at 4 in the morning. The barn light was on. Everett Ashby was standing outside with his hat off, holding it against his chest with both hands, the way a man holds a hat when he does not know what else to do with his hands. He was 66 years old, broad through the shoulders, gone soft around the middle, from 30 winters of stove cookies, and his eyes were red not from crying, but from the cold, and from having seen something he could not unsee. He said, "Sylvie." I said, "Where?" He pointed with his chin, not with his hand. Ephraim Renwick was 78 years old. He had milked cows on the same 112 acres of Vermont hill ground for 51 years, and he died on a Tuesday morning. At some hour, nobody would ever be exactly sure of sitting on the low bench beside the workbench in his own barn with a carpenter's pencil in his right hand and a butter churn between his knees. The pencil was still in his fingers when I got there. That detail matters. Everybody forgets it later, but the pencil was still in his fingers, held the way you hold a pencil when you are mid-sentence. The sheriff was a young man named Coombs. I had gone to school with 2 years ahead. He was standing by the tack wall with his hands loose at his sides, looking at nothing in particular, which is how a decent man behaves when the girl who used to sit behind him in 10th grade algebra has just come to identify her only living grandparent. He said he was sorry. I said thank you. He said the coroner would want to know, but it looked to him like his heart had just quit. Ephraim was not a young man. It had been fast. There was no expression on his face that was not the ordinary expression of a man who had been about to say something to himself and had forgotten what. I nodded. Coombs said, "Sylvie, I hate to ask this now." I said, "Ask it." He said the log by his elbow. There was writing in it, fresh writing, ink still wet enough to smudge when he had turned the page. Would I want to see the last thing my grandfather wrote before I did anything else? I said yes. He walked me over. The book was open. The pencil hand I had known my whole life was on the page. "Sylvie will need the folder in the north drawer," it said. And under that line on its own, underlined twice, "Everything worth keeping was once called scrap by someone in a hurry." I read it twice, then I read it a third time. Because you do not get to read a message like that in the middle of a barn at 4 in the morning and simply nod. You read it 3 times and then you put your right hand into the pocket of your grandfather's coat and you close your fingers on the brass-cased folding rule you had put in there 4 hours earlier when you had gone to bed corners, polished bright from 50 years of his thumb. And you squeeze it until you can feel the shape of the brass through the fabric of the pocket lining. And then you say, "All right," one more time because it is the only word you have left that is safe. I was small in that barn, 5'3", dark auburn hair the wind kept blowing across my face, freckles standing hard across the bridge of my nose, a pale birthmark the shape of a thumbprint just below my left ear that I have never covered because Ephraim once told me it looked like the mark a potter leaves on a jar to prove the jar was made by hand. 24 years old. Just told in a sentence pressed hard enough into the paper to dent it that whatever came next was my job. 22 people came to the funeral. I counted them at the gate. Late March, still cold wind coming across the hillside cemetery outside Barton, with that particular Vermont edge that gets under a coat no matter what you wear. I stood at the edge of the grave with my hands loose at my sides, chin down, shoulders squared under the olive green barn coat that was 2 sizes too big. The preacher used the word rest 6 times, and every time he said it, I squeezed the brass rule in my coat pocket harder each time. My father was not there. Sit with that for a moment. Not because I want your pity. That fact is the pivot the whole story turns on, and I did not know it yet. Percival Renwick, my father, lived in Burlington. He sold insurance. He had not spoken to his own father since 1977, which is when he left the farm at 23 and got in a Ford Fairlane and drove south down Route 5 and never came back. He and my mother divorced when I was 11. My mother moved to New Hampshire. I went to live on the farm at 14 because I asked to, and because my father did not fight it, and because Ephraim was already teaching me how to sharpen a draw knife on a slow wet stone with the same care other grandfathers teach their grandchildren how to say their prayers. Percival did not come to his father's funeral. I did not call him. Aunt Vera did not call him. Nobody called him. That was the arrangement. That was the arrangement for 27 years, and I did not question it, not at 14 and not at 24 standing in the cold with the dirt already thawing under my boots. Except one of those 22 people at the graveside was a man I did not recognize standing far back near the wrought iron gate. Gray overcoat, hands in his pockets, chin down. He left before the preacher stopped speaking. I did not see his face. I did not think about him again for 6 weeks. What I inherited on paper looked like this. 112 acres of tired Vermont dairy ground, most of it in poor fescue and second-growth alder that had crept in during the 10 years Ephraim had cut back to 14 head. A milking parlor built in 1962 for 32 head with equipment older than I was. 14 Guernseys and 2 Jerseys, 4 of them past their productive years. A farmhouse with a slate roof that leaked over the west bedroom. A hay barn built by Ephraim's own grandfather in 1908. 60 by 43 floors, cedar sided still square. $9,700 of debt at Orleans County Trust, mostly feed and vet bills from the last two winters, when Ephraim had been too proud to call and too broke to buy quality hay. The Orleans County assessor put the ground at $418 an acre. The cooperative's offer, which arrived by certified mail 9 days after the funeral, was $460. Generous, the letter said, given the condition of the improvements. It was signed Vaughn Trumbull, General Manager, Northeast Kingdom Dairy Cooperative. Everybody in that valley figured I would take it. That was the general assumption at the feed store in Barton, at the diner in West Glover, at the coffee shop on Route 5, where men in seed caps drank coffee and did other people's arithmetic. A girl that age dropped out of UVM after 2 years alone with a mortgage and 14 head, and no husband and no money. Give her a year. She would sell by Christmas and go get a job in Burlington like a sensible person. I did not answer the letter. Instead, I spent the first 3 weeks doing what you do when a man dies and leaves you his whole life in a pile. I went through the house room by room. On the 9th day, I opened the north drawer in the bedroom that had been his, and I found the folder. Manila, my name on it in his pencil hand. Sylvie, just that. Underneath the folder, filling the drawer to the bottom, were the logbooks. I counted them. 14, scuffed brown leather, each with a rubber band around it. The rubber on the oldest ones gone brittle and snapping when I touched them. 40 years of a man writing things down in pencil. I sat on the floor of that bedroom and I opened the folder first. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed on the flatbed typewriter he had bought used in 1972. It said, Sylvie, if you are reading this, then things did not go the way I planned. Read the books in order. The 1954 book is the one to start with. Everything you will need is already written down. I did not have time to organize it the way I wanted to. I am sorry. Everything worth keeping was once called scrap by someone in a hurry. Do not forget that. Underneath his signature in pencil, one more line. Added later after the typing. The handwriting shakier than the writing in the barn. He must have gone back to it in the last months. The line said, the Nordquist churns are the key. Read them like a book. I did not know what that meant. Not then. I put the folder aside and I picked up the 1954 logbook. The rubber band broke in my fingers when I pulled it. The cover fell open on its own, the way old books do, to a first page gone soft and yellow at the edges. One line at the top, written slow, pressed hard enough to dent the paper in the blocky pencil hand of a man who had been 29 years old and just starting. Everything worth keeping was once called scrap by someone in a hurry. Underlined twice. I read it and I read it again, and then I sat on the floor of my grandfather's bedroom for a very long time, with the book open across my knees, and I did not cry. I did not cry because crying is a private matter, and the barn is not the place for it, and neither is the bedroom of a man who has just been buried. The kitchen is the place for it. The kitchen at night alone with the stove door open and the tea gone cold in the cup, and even then, only if you have finished the day's work first. But I did open every one of those 14 logbooks that afternoon, and I read until the light went blue at the edges of the window, and here is what I found. They were not farm records. Oh, some of it was. Rainfall and breeding dates and the price of a ton of soybean meal in 1968. But most of the pages were about wood and steel and stamps, sketches of dovetail joints, notes on white oak versus red, on how quartered staves swell tight and flat ones cup and leak, pages and pages on maker's marks, the stamped names on the iron bands and the cast crank handles of butter churns, which foundry cast which crank, which Ohio company folded in 1911 and which Pennsylvania one lasted till the war, which Vermont maker used a brass rivet and which one used iron. He would write things like Daisy number 40 glass, worthless, everybody has one. And 2 lines down, wooden barrel churn, cedar Vermont maker, cast crank intact, nobody wants these yet. Yet underlined. Nobody wants these yet. The brass folding rule was in the drawer with the logbooks. I put it in my coat pocket that afternoon and it never really left. Aunt Vera came by on a Saturday. The way she came by every Saturday in her red pickup truck that had been a wedding gift from her husband in 1962 and had outlived him by 19 years. 71 years old, my grandfather's older sister gone quiet since her husband died. She brought a covered casserole dish and a loaf of bread wrapped in a checkered towel, and she set them on the counter without asking me to move anything. She said, "Beef stew, enough for 4 days." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Are you eating?" I said, "Sometimes." She looked at me for a long time, silver gray hair braided down her back, hands rough as bark, wearing her husband's canvas jacket, the same way I was wearing my grandfather's. Then she reached into her coat pocket and set something on the counter beside the bread. A small tin of tea, sugar, a jar of honey from her own bees. She said, "Ephraim liked the honey in his tea. If you can't sleep." I said, "Aunt Vera." She said, "Come Sunday if you want. Coffee's at 7." Then she left. She did not stay for coffee herself. She did not hug me. She did not ask if I had called my father. She got in her red truck and she drove down the gravel, and she did not come back for 2 weeks. Understand something about my family. We did not talk. That was not a failure. That was a policy. 10 days after the funeral, a car came up the gravel that had no business on gravel. Dark blue Buick, polished to a shine that would not survive the mud. Out stepped a man in a charcoal gray suit jacket and a maroon tie and rimless rectangular glasses that caught the flat Vermont light. Slim aluminum clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield chrome clasp gleaming before he had shut the car door. Vaughn Trumbull, General Manager, Northeast Kingdom Dairy Cooperative. 48 years old, thinning sandy hair combed with something wet. His job was explaining to Vermont dairy families why their lives were now obsolete. He did that patient little smile of his, rocked heel to toe on the frozen mud. He said, "Miss Renwick, I'll be brief because I know you've got well." He glanced at the sagging line fence, the barn, the whole 112 acres. "A situation here." I stood in the yard in that faded olive green barn coat, gray work shirt, underneath jeans worn white at the knees, boots laced in rust orange. Cold putting a red across my cheeks and over the freckles on my nose. I did not invite him in. I did not offer coffee. I let him talk, and boy did he. The cooperative, he explained, was converting the whole 4-county route to bulk refrigerated tanks. Modernization. Efficiency. Cans were done. The old 10-gallon shotgun cans and the 15-gallon butter churns every dairy in Orleans County had used since before Ephraim Renwick was born were now in the co-op's language legacy inventory. Then he flipped a page on that aluminum clipboard and got to the good part. $75 per churn, disposal fee, charged back to each farm for the environmental handling of scrap steel and cedar the co-op itself had made worthless. Now your grandfather ran 14 cans and 11 wooden butter churns, Vaughn Trumbull said, and he tapped the page with one clean fingernail. So that's a little over $1,800 owed on a property that frankly isn't generating a dollar. Which brings me to the offer. The offer was the buyout. Land, herd equipment, farmhouse, one lump sum, walk away clean. He read the number off the clipboard the way a doctor reads a bad chart. Then he looked at me over the rimless glasses. He said, "I'll be honest with you because nobody else will. You're 24. You've got no capital, no contracts, and a barn full of your grandfather's hobbies. Sentiment's a lovely thing, but it doesn't pass a milk inspection." He paused, rocked heel to toe again. "Old men die and leave girls their messes. Don't be the one who's still standing here in 5 years wondering where it all went." Then he said the sentence, "Your father figured this out at your age. I knew Percival back when he still came around. Smart boy. Left. Best thing he ever did. He'd tell you the same." That was the first time I had heard my father's name spoken aloud by anybody outside my own family in 6 years. I looked at Vaughn Trumbull for a long moment, chin slightly down, hands loose at my sides. I said, "The farm is not for sale." 5 words. He waited for the rest. There was not any rest. Vaughn Trumbull clicked his pen, made a small notation on the clipboard, drove off in a car that had never once been asked to do anything hard. Here is what the cooperative did not advertise. The conversion did not just make Ephraim's 25 churns and cans into scrap. It made every wooden butter churn and every tin can on every farm, from Franklin County to the Connecticut River, into scrap all at once in the same 90 days. Roughly 700 of them hauled off farms whose owners were too busy financing bulk tanks at 9% to care where the old vessels went. The co-op piled them in a warehouse outside Newport and scheduled a clearance auction because storing scrap cost money, and the co-op does not spend money on anything that does not smile back. I did not go to that auction to buy. Not at first. I went to look because the 1954 logbook had a page on the Northeast Kingdom Dairy Cooperative warehouse. Ephraim had written it in 1978. 6 lines. If the co-op ever sells its stored churns as one lot go, do not go with a plan. Go with a rule and a lamp. Bring the brass. Bring your eyes. Do not bid until you have walked the whole row. I did not know what the brass was until I put my hand in my pocket that morning and closed my fingers around the folding rule. Then I understood. The auction was on a Saturday in early April. The warehouse was a cinder block building on Route 105 north of Newport, with a corrugated tin roof that popped and creaked as the sun came off the frost. I got there 2 hours early, and I walked the rows alone. 700 churns and cans stacked 4 high on wooden pallets, dented dings, some with the lids gone, breath fogging in the cold. I was not looking at the dents. I was crouching, tipping each one, reading the base stamps. The maker's mark punched into the bottom rim or burned into the underside of an oak lid. Buckeye, Peerless of Detroit, Ashen and Sons of Louisville. On some of them, in a small oval 3 letters, and a place name I had seen circled in Ephraim's 1971 logbook. J. Nordquist and Sons, Enosburg Falls. I unfolded the brass rule and measured wall thickness at the seams, checked the rolled shoulders, ran my thumbnail along the tinning where it had worn through to steel and where it had not. Looked at the stave count on the wooden barrel churns. 11 staves each on the Nordquists. Riven, not sawn. You can tell because a sawn stave breaks its own grain at the tool marks, and a riven one follows the grain like water follows a channel it has already made. I was doing arithmetic that nobody else in that building knew existed. By the time the auctioneer walked in with his gavel and his ledger and his cigarette, I had counted 118 Nordquists in that lot. I had counted them twice because I could not believe the first count. The auctioneer opened it as one lot, 700 units sold together. Buyer hauls. He asked for $1 a can as a joke. He got laughter. He dropped to 50 cents. A voice from the back said $3. The room turned. There I was, small-shouldered, 5'3", dark auburn hair pushed back under a wool cap. The pale birthmark below my left ear. Catching the fluorescent light, standing with my shoulders squared like I was waiting for a bus. Then I saw him. Standing at the back of the warehouse near the loading dock door in a gray overcoat, hands in his pockets, chin down. 50 years old. A face I had seen twice a year in Christmas cards until I was 11, and then not at all, and then again for a moment through the wrought iron gate of a cemetery 6 weeks ago. Percival Renwick, my father. I was moving before I had finished registering that he was there. Moving fast for a man of his age, cutting between 2 rows of churns coming toward me, his face pale and set in a way I had never seen in any photograph. The auctioneer said, $3 from the lady, do I hear 4? Nobody said 4. The auctioneer said, $3 going once. Percival reached me. He put his hand on my arm, not gripping, placed, the way a man places a hand on a horse's neck when the horse is about to do something foolish. He said, Sylvie, just that. One word. I said, don't. He said, listen to me. I said, don't. He said, you do not know what you are doing. I said, then explain it, but not now. He said, Sylvie, you are going to become him. I am the only person in this room who knows exactly what that looks like from the inside because I lived it, and I got out and I'm asking you. I was not angry. That is the part I have never been able to explain to anybody, and I have tried. He was not angry. He was afraid. My father, Percival Renwick, whom I had not spoken to in 6 years, whom I had not looked in the face in 11, was standing in a warehouse outside Newport, telling me not to buy 700 butter churns because he was afraid. The auctioneer said $3 going twice. I looked at my father, really looked. Gray at the temples now, deep lines from his nose down to the corners of his mouth. The Renwick chin, my chin. Freckles across his nose gone lighter with age. He looked like Ephraim. He looked exactly like Ephraim, and I do not think he knew it, and I do not think anybody had ever told him. I said, "Where were you 6 weeks ago?" He did not answer. I said, "You were at the gate." He did not answer. I said, "Percival." His eyes closed for one full second. When he opened them, there was something in them I had not expected to see there in my lifetime. He said I could not come inside. The auctioneer said sold. $3 a churn, 700 churns, $2,100 to the young lady in the back. The gavel came down. My father let go of my arm. I wrote the check on the hood of a stranger's flatbed truck in the cold, with my cheeks gone red, and the auctioneer read the amount out loud and looked at me and laughed. Not cruel, bewildered. $2,100 out of a checking account that had 4,000 and change in it. Most of it, his life insurance payout, all of what I had. Percival watched. He did not leave. He stood by the loading dock with his hands in his pockets, and he watched me write the check, and he watched me hand it to the auctioneer, and he watched me walk out to the truck of a fellow from Craftsbury. I had paid $11 in diesel and a promise to borrow a flatbed, and he watched me load the first 62 churns by myself in the cold, while the warehouse crew stood around watching a woman do something they had already decided was stupid. He did not help. He did not ask if I needed help. He did not speak to me again. When I finished loading and climbed up into the truck cab, I looked back at the warehouse door. He was gone. The first flatbed came up the gravel on a Tuesday morning in a cold that turned my cheeks red before I had walked 20 feet from the house. 62 churns chained down under a tarp, rattling like a box of bells every time the truck hit a rut. I stood in the yard in the faded olive barn coat, with my hands loose at my sides, chin down, watching the driver back toward the fence line. He asked me where I wanted them. I said, along the rail, handles out. 4 words. That was load 1 of 11. 6 weeks I hauled. I borrowed Everett Ashby's flatbed twice, and then I quit asking and rented one out of Newport for $18 a day, plus fuel, because Everett had started doing that thing where he sipped from the chipped white enamel mug he carried everywhere, and did not say anything for a long time before he said yes. He was reading me. I could feel it. I did not want to be read. Not yet. That was the beginning of the mistake I would spend 4 months making, but I did not know it was a mistake yet. I only knew I did not want anybody's help. Not from Everett, not from Aunt Vera, not from anybody who might turn out to be right about something I was not ready to hear. I learned to load the churns myself. 40-pound bodies, tipping them onto the rim and walking them heel to heel like a man moves a refrigerator. My forearms went hard as fence wire. My palms cracked at the base of every finger, and I wrapped them in athletic tape and kept going. By the end of April, there were 700 vessels stacked along 400 feet of fence on the Renwick place. From Route 5, it looked like a wrecked army. Silver gray dented, some of them gone the color of old Nichols lids, on handles out the whole line of them, catching the low sun so the fence glowed at 4 in the afternoon. People slowed down. That is how it starts in a place like Orleans County. Nobody knocks. They just take their foot off the gas at your mailbox and look. And by Sunday, the word has traveled further than you have. The word was hoarding. You know the tone. Poor girl lost it. Old Ephraim filled that barn with junk for 40 years, and now she's filling the whole damn field. Somebody at the feed store said she had paid $2,100 of a dead man's money for scrap she could not even sell for scrap. Somebody else said that is what happens when you leave a farm to a girl who never worked a real job. And Vaughn Trumbull, when a co-op board member asked him about it over coffee at the diner in West Glover, adjusted those rimless glasses and smiled that small, patient smile and said, I offered her $75 a ton to make it go away. Her father tried to talk sense into her at the auction. Some people just can't be helped. She'll be back with her hand out by August and I'll be kind about it. Out. He said kind like it was a favor he had already decided to charge her for. I never heard it. I was busy sorting. Here's the part nobody driving past understood. Those 700 churns and cans were not one thing. They were maybe 11 things wearing the same coat. So I took the brass-cased folding rule out of my right coat pocket, and I started at the north end of the fence and worked south one vessel at a time on my knees in the frost. Sorted by maker. Galloway of Cincinnati stamped their name in an arc on the shoulder, a deep, clean die, and their handles were riveted through a doubled plate. Ashen and Sons out of Louisville used a smaller stamp low on the body and their lids seated with a half-turn lug. Then there were the unmarked ones, the import stamps, a little cluster of letters and a number under the base rim. Thinner steel, cheaper tin seams rolled tight but shallow. Then there were the Nordquists, 118 of them, the little oval stamp on the underside of the oak lid. J. Nordquist and Sons, Annisburg Falls. On some of them next to the maker's mark a second smaller stamp, a three-petaled flower, a Vermont maple leaf. I did not know what the second stamp meant. I opened the 1971 logbook that night at the kitchen table under the buzzing bulb, and I read every page. On page 47 in Ephraim's hand, the note I had been carrying without knowing I was carrying it. Nordquist, Enosburg Falls, closed 1934. Grandmother's people made these. If the maple leaf is stamped, the churn was ordered by a specific family. They had reasons. Some of the reasons are still inside. Some of the reasons are still inside. I read that line at the kitchen table with the stew Aunt Vera had brought going cold at my elbow. The world tipped half an inch. I walked out to the barn at 11 at night with the lantern in one hand and the brass rule in the other. I picked out one Nordquist with the maple leaf stamp. Number 43 in my count. 16-gallon body oak staves gone soft gray with age iron hoops pitted at the seams. Heavier than it should have been. That was the tell. I had not caught it during the day because I had been thinking about wood and metal, and I had not been thinking about weight. I set it on the workbench in the lantern light. I turned it upside down. The false bottom was so well made, I did not see it until I ran my thumb along the interior seam and felt where the oak had been cut on the inside and glued back with hide glue that had darkened to the color of the rest of the wood. I got a putty knife. I worked it slow, because Ephraim had written in the margin of a page I had read 3 days earlier, "Do not pry. Wait. Warm it. Let the glue release. You cannot rush what 100 years of dry Vermont winter has already decided." I set the lantern close and let the heat sit against the false bottom for the space of 1 full hour. I did not touch it. I sat on the low bench where my grandfather had died with the pencil still in his hand. Watched the shadow of the lantern flame move across the barn wall. Thought about my father standing at the wrought iron gate of a cemetery in a gray overcoat 6 weeks ago, unable to come inside. At the end of the hour, the false bottom lifted with the pressure of one thumb. There was a bottle inside, green glass, hand-blown. The kind of bottle that has not been made in a Vermont glasswork since 1928. Sealed with wax at the neck, still full. Burned into the bottom of the false compartment in the same brass die that had marked the maker's oval on the outside 3 letters in a year. ERR 1929. Ephraim Ross Renwick, my grandfather. Born 1925. He would have been 4 years old in 1929. I stood in the lantern light in my grandfather's barn, holding a green glass bottle of what could only have been Vermont maple whiskey, sealed by a man who had been alive when Prohibition was still the law of the land, in a churn made by my great-grandmother's people, in a town 43 miles up the road. And I understood standing there with the brass rule in my pocket and the wind coming down off the mountain that I had misunderstood absolutely everything. The churns, the logbooks, my grandfather. And worst of all, why my father had driven to a warehouse in Newport to try to stop me from buying them. There were 117 more Nordquists with maple leaf stamps out along that fence line. I set the bottle on the workbench beside the lantern. I closed the false bottom. I walked out into the yard in the black cold of an April midnight in Vermont, and I stood in front of the 400-foot fence line of 700 vessels the whole county had already agreed were trash. And I said out loud to nobody in the voice of a woman who had just realized she was standing on the front porch of a house much bigger than she had ever been told existed. I said, "Oh, just that." One syllable. The wind kept coming. The lantern hissed inside the barn. I put my right hand in my coat pocket. I closed my fingers around the brass. I said out loud to my grandfather wherever he was. I said, "All right." Then I went inside and I called my Aunt Vera on the black rotary phone in the kitchen at 12 minutes past midnight. And when she picked up on the fourth ring in the voice of a woman who had been expecting the call for 6 weeks, I said only one sentence. I said, "Aunt Vera, why did my father leave the farm in 1977? There was a long silence on the line. Then Aunt Vera said, "Sylvie." Then she said, "Come up here tomorrow." "Not tonight, tomorrow, I will make coffee." Then she hung up. I stood in the kitchen with the receiver in my hand and the dial tone humming. I understood that the story I had been living in for 24 years was not the story I had been told. The next thing I was going to learn was going to change the shape of everything I thought I knew about the man who had raised me, the man who had left, and the woman I was about to become. I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the 1954 logbook open in front of me, and I copied out the first line onto a fresh sheet of paper in my own hand, in pencil pressed hard enough to dent the paper. Everything worth keeping was one called scrap by someone in a hurry, underlined twice. I taped the paper to the inside of the kitchen cupboard where the sugar was kept. Then I put on my grandfather's coat, and I walked back out to the barn, and I picked up churn number 43 by both handles, and I carried it into the workshop, and I set it on the low bench where Ephraim had died, and I sat down beside it in the lantern light, and I said out loud to a green glass bottle in a false bottom that had been waiting 75 years for somebody to be quiet enough to find it one more sentence. I said, "Show me what he wanted me to see." The lantern kept its steady sound. Somewhere out along the fence line in the black cold of a Vermont April at 1 in the morning, 117 more Nordquist churns with maple leaf stamps stood in a long silver line, waiting. For now, remember only this. A 24-year-old girl standing in a Vermont hay barn on the first Saturday in April with a brass folding rule in her pocket and a green glass bottle on the workbench and 700 churns along her fence line. 118 of them, with a stamp 4 counties, had never learned to read. A father she had not spoken to in 6 years who had shown up at an auction to try to stop her. An aunt on the other end of a phone line saying, "Come up here tomorrow, I will make coffee." A grandfather in the ground 3 weeks who had written her a note in pencil pressed hard enough to dent the paper. Everything worth keeping was once called scrap by someone in a hurry. She was about to learn what that meant. She was about to spend 3 years learning what that meant. Aunt Vera's house sat at the end of a dirt road 3 miles up from the state line. Cedar shingled roof gone silver from 40 winters. One crooked chimney throwing a thin line of wood smoke straight up into a windless April sky. I got there at 9 in the morning. I had not slept. She opened the door before I knocked. She said, "You look like your grandmother." I said, "Nobody has ever said that to me." She said, "That is because everybody who could say it is dead." Then she stepped aside and let me in. The kitchen smelled like coffee and yeast, and the particular smell of a woman who has lived alone for 19 years and stopped apologizing for it. She had made a pot on the wood stove. She poured me a cup without asking how I took it. Black, no sugar. She had known. She sat across from me at the small pine table with her hands wrapped around her own mug, and she looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Your grandmother's name was Elin Nordquist. She was 22 when she married your grandfather in 1948. She died in childbirth in 1952. Your father was 3. I said, "I know." She said, "You know she died. You do not know why." I did not answer. She looked down into her coffee. Then she said, "There are 3 things you need to hear from me before you hear them from anybody else. 2 of them I will say. The third belongs to your father. Are you listening?" I said, "Yes." She said, "1. The Nordquists made whiskey in the false bottoms of their churns. They stopped in the mid-1940s. There is a reason they stopped. That reason will come from Percival. I said, all right. She said, too, your grandfather spent his whole life buying those churns back, not to destroy them, to hold them, until the person he trusted with them was old enough. She looked up. She said, that was you. He knew from the day you were 4 years old. He put it in writing when you were 7. I said, Aunt Vera. She said, I know. I said the rest of it. She closed her eyes for a long moment. Then she said, come Sunday, I will feed you supper. Your father will be here. He has been coming to my kitchen every second Sunday for 9 years, and I have not told anyone, and neither has he. He will tell you the third thing then, not now, because if I tell you now, you will drive to Burlington tonight, and you will do something you cannot take back. And I did not spend 9 years feeding that man biscuits for you to do that. I sat with my coffee in my hands for a long time. I said, you have been feeding my father supper for 9 years. She said, yes. I said, does Ephraim know? She said, Ephraim knew. Ephraim did not come to Sunday supper. Ephraim did not want to. But Ephraim knew, since 1995. It was his idea. He told me once at Christmas, Vera, someone has to keep an eye on Percival because the world will forgive that boy long before I do, and I want him watched by somebody who has forgiven him already. I said, you forgave him. She said, I have been forgiving him for 27 years. It is not a place you arrive at. It is a place you keep walking. I set the coffee down. I did not drink it. Aunt Vera reached across the table and put her hand on my wrist. She did not squeeze. She placed. Her hand was rough as bark and cold from the mug. She said, Sylvie. I said, what? She said, go home. Do the work. The story does not go anywhere. It has been where it is for 52 years. Then she hugged me. The first hug I had received from her in 11 years. She smelled like wood smoke and lemon balm, and she held me for the length of one breath, and then she stepped back. I drove home. I did not call my father, because I was not ready, because I did not know what the question was. Because when you have been raised by a man who wrote things down in pencil, you learn early that the question comes before the answer. And if you do not know the question, you do not deserve the answer. So instead, I did what Ephraim had trained me to do. I went to work. Here is what nobody tells you about restoring a 100-year-old butter churn. The wood is not the problem. The steel is not the problem. You are the problem. I picked a Galloway body first. A plain one. No maple leaf. Fist-sized dent in the lower body. Straight base. Tight lid. I told myself I would practice on the plain ones and save the Nordquists for when I knew what I was doing. That was the first sensible thing I had done in a month. It did not last. I set the churn on a sandbag cradle. I lit the torch Ephraim kept on the shelf. My reasoning was fast and completely wrong. Warm metal moves easier. So I brought the flame in low and swept it across the crease until the steel went dull straw. Then a bloom of blue, and the tin lining hissed and went silver and ran down the side of the body. I should have stopped there. I was tired, I was cold, and the metal looked so soft and willing. I set the wooden shape inside the barrel to back the dent from behind, picked up the hammer, started at the outer edge of the crease working inward. The first 5 blows brought it out. Beautiful. The steel rose under the hammer like bread. I could feel it, that clean giving thump that tells your arm the shape is coming back. Halfway through the 6th swing, I heard something I had not heard before. Not a ring, a dry click. Somewhere down and to the left of where I was working. I hit it again, because I was already committed, because you are 24 years old and you always hit it again. The seam let go. It ran fast, a black hairline splitting 9 inches down the body. The solder from 1938 letting the 2 lapped edges walk apart. The tin blistered white along the tear. The body shivered on the sandbag, sagged inward, where the dent had been and folded like laundry. I did not swear. I did not kick anything. I got down on my knees in my dark denim jeans worn white where the knees hit the boards, and I put my face 2 inches from the failure and I looked at it until I understood. Three things had killed it. Heat first. I had swept the tin cold and fast, and cold tin under a hammerwork hardens. The metal gets stiff and brittle right where you are asking it to stretch. Every blow makes the next blow worse. The torch had warmed the outside long enough to loosen the solder, but not long enough to make the whole wall move as one piece. Rhythm second. I had been swinging like a woman fixing a fence post. No time between blows for the metal to settle. You have to let it choose its own line. The third thing, the one that mattered. My shape was not the shape of the barrel. I had picked a block that was almost right, and almost right is the same as wrong when you are asking a 100-year-old lap seam to hold. When there is nothing solid behind the metal, the hammer pushes the wall against air, and air will tear before it will bend. Ephraim had written it out in the 1961 logbook, in pencil. If the dolly does not kiss every square inch of the inside curve, the metal is doing your work for you. You are just deciding where it fails. I read that line at the kitchen table with the rubber band still hooked on my thumb, and I felt like the world's slowest student. That is when Everett Ashby drove up. Blue Ford pickup, chipped white enamel mug in his fist. He did not get out of the truck. He rolled the window down. He looked at me across the yard. He said, "Sylvie." I said, "Everett." He said, "I heard something break in there." I said, "I broke it." He said, "Do you want to know how not to break the next one?" I said, "No." He looked at me for a long moment. 66 years old, broad through the shoulders, gone soft around the middle, faded red seed cap sitting square on his head. He looked at me the way a man looks at a horse that is about to hurt itself. He said, "Sylvie, listen." I said, "Everett, go home." He said, "I do not need to teach you. I need to tell you what to read. Your grandfather wrote it out, volume 9, page 142. Cold work, wood dolly, sandbag. He was going to teach you before he died. He told me at the diner in February. He said in April I am going to walk her through it. He did not get to April. I said, "Everett, go home." He did not go home right away. He sat in his truck with the mug in his hand, and he looked at the row of churns along my fence line for a long time. Then he looked at me. He said, "Your grandfather was the finest tin man in 3 counties. Nobody knew it. He did not want anybody to know it. But he was going to give it to you. Do not make him have died for nothing." Then he backed the truck down the gravel, and he drove away. I stood in the yard with my hands loose at my sides, and I did not move for a long time. I did not read volume 9, not that night, not the next, not for 4 months, because I had been told I was on my own, and I had decided that being on my own meant refusing help even from a man in a blue Ford pickup whose hat was already off before he had asked me anything. That was the mistake. That was the mistake I would spend 127 days making. I broke 15 churns in the next 3 months. 15. I logged every one of them in the back of the 1954 logbook. Body number 2 seam held, but the tin puckered and popped like a cheap can lid under thumb pressure. Overworked. Body 3 split at the top hoop because I had hammered within an inch of the crimp, and the crimp has no give. New rule written in pencil: stay 2 full inches off any crimp. Body 4, the wood swelled and cracked the staves because I had soaked it too long. Bodies 5 and 6 went into the lye tank. That was where I learned the ugliest lesson of the whole winter. I had been scrubbing the interior. 60 years of soured milk fat, 60 years of scorched cream baked to a hard shellac. With lye and a wire cut brush on a drill, it cut through the crust beautifully. It also cut through the tin plating. Under that plating sits mild steel, and mild steel touching dairy turns everything gray and rusts within a week. I ruined 2 good bodies before I caught it. A bright silver patch the size of a quarter, and the moment I touched it with a damp rag, in orange bloom. New rule: underline twice. Lye in hot water and a soft brush on the interiors. No wire, no drill. Wire cup only on the outer hoops where it is iron anyway and headed for paint. I had wanted to strip everything down to shining. The churn had told me no. Some of what looks like damage is the armor keeping the thing alive. Sunday came. I did not go. I told myself I was too tired. I told myself the churns needed me. I told myself a lot of things standing in the kitchen with my coat half on. Then I took the coat off and I sat down at the table and I looked at Aunt Vera's phone number written in Ephraim's pencil hand in the inside cover of the 1998 logbook, and I did not call. She did not call either. 2 weeks passed. 3 weeks. Then a letter came. Not from Aunt Vera. From the Orleans County Superior Court. Certified mail. Signed for by me on the porch in the olive green barn coat with the sun coming up over the ridge behind the barn. I opened it standing there. Percival Renwick of Burlington, Vermont, was petitioning the court for a partial partition of the Renwick family estate. He was claiming a family trust settlement of $23,000 that had gone unresolved since the death of his own mother in 1978, plus a proportional interest in the improvements at 214 Ridge Road, Orleans County. Hearing date, May 14th, 60 days out. I read the letter twice, then I read it a third time. Then I sat down on the porch step in the olive green barn coat with the letter in my right hand, and I did not cry. I got up, I went inside. I put the letter on the kitchen table beside the sugar cupboard where the taped copy of the 1954 first line was still where I had put it. And I stood in the kitchen with the two pieces of paper side by side, and I did the arithmetic. $23,000. I had $611 in my checking account. My savings account had been closed the day I bought the churns. I could not pay him. I could sell the farm. I could sell the farm and I could pay him. I could sell the farm and I could pay him, and I could go get a job in Burlington, and I could rent a room from a woman with 3 cats, and I could file the whole thing under a lesson learned. Or I could stand in this kitchen and I could look at a piece of paper my grandfather had taped to the inside of my head with a pencil pressed hard enough to dent it, and I could refuse. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I stood in the kitchen until the light went blue at the edges of the window. Then Von Trumbull came up the gravel. I heard the Buick before I saw it. That soft, expensive idol. I did not step outside. I did not open the door. I let him ring the bell. He rang it twice. Then he stepped back on the porch and he waited. I opened the door. He was in the charcoal gray suit jacket, maroon tie, rimless glasses, clipboard against his chest. He had timed his visit. He had waited until the certified mail from the Orleans County Superior Court had been delivered before he had put himself in that car. I could see it in his face. He said, "Miss Renwick, I heard." I said, "You heard fast." He said, "Orleans County is a small county." I said, "It is not that small." He said, "May I come in?" I said, "No." He stood on the porch in his polished black Oxfords, and he did that small, patient smile. He said, "Sylvie." I said, "Miss Renwick." He said, "Miss Renwick, I want to help. I am going to be honest with you because nobody else will." I said, "The last time you were honest with me, you told me my father figured this out at my age." His smile did not move. He said, "That is because he did." I said, "You knew my father." He said, "I worked with him in Burlington, 1993, Northeast Kingdom Insurance Burlington branch. 2 years, he is a fine man. He carries his mistakes better than most men carry their wins." I said, "What mistakes?" Von Trumbull looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Renwick, that is his to tell." That was the second time in 3 weeks I had heard that sentence. I said, "What do you want?" He said, "The cooperative is prepared to purchase the entire property, the herd, the equipment, and the contents of both barns. $56,000. Wire transfer. 72 hours. That figure includes settling your father's claim before the May 14th hearing. You walk away clean. Your father walks away with what he is owed. Nobody has to stand in a courtroom in front of a judge and read anything into the record." I said, "The contents of both barns." He said, "Yes." I said, "You have never asked what is in the barns." His smile shifted half an inch. If you had not been watching for it, you would not have caught it. I was watching for it. He said, Miss Renwick, I do not need to. I said, you do. He said, I do not. I said, Vaughn. He said, I do not need to know what is in the barns because whatever is in them is worth less to you than $56,000 in the next 72 hours. I said, you do not know that. He said, I know that your father did not come to his father's funeral, and I know that he came to an auction 6 weeks later to try to stop you from bidding. And I know that the last time a Renwick tried to run this ground, he ran it into $9,700 of debt at Orleans County Trust. And I know that you are 24 years old and you have never worked a real job. And I know that whatever is in those barns has been in those barns for the better part of a century. And if it were worth what you seem to think it is worth, somebody would have found it before you. I said, somebody did. He blinked. He said, what? I said, my grandfather found it in 1958, and he found more of it in 1962, and again in 1971, and again in 1984, and again as recently as 1998. He found it 47 separate times, and he did not tell anybody, and he did not sell any of it, and he waited to give it to me. Vaughn Trumbull did not move. He said, what is it? I said, that is my grandfather's to tell. His smile went thin at the edges. He said, Miss Renwick, the offer stands until Friday at 5. Then he clicked his pen, made a small notation on the clipboard, and walked back to his Buick. He did not look back. I closed the door. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the door and my knees drawn up under my chin like a child, and I stayed there for a long time. Because I had lied. I had lied to Vaughn Trumbull twice in one breath. I did not know if my grandfather had found more of them in 1958 or 1962 or 1971 or 1984 or 1998. I had made up those years standing there on the porch. I had watched Vaughn Trumbull's smile go thin at the edges, and I had understood two things at once. The first was that I was going to have to become a person who could lie to a man in a charcoal gray suit jacket without her voice moving. The second was that Vaughn Trumbull had not come to my house because he wanted the farm. He had come because he wanted the contents of the barn. He knew. He knew something. I was not sure what he knew, but he knew enough to have driven up my gravel driveway at 6 o'clock in the evening on the day my father's court papers had been delivered, and he had offered me $56,000 in 72 hours, which was more than the whole property was worth on the tax rolls. And he had said the words, the contents of both barns, and he had said them without asking a single question about what those contents were. Somebody had told him. Somebody had told him something. And there were only 3 people alive who could have told him. One was my father. One was Aunt Vera. One was Everett Ashby. I did not think it was my aunt. I got up off the kitchen floor. I put the certified letter and the piece of paper taped to the sugar cupboard into the folder Ephraim had left me in the north drawer. I wrote 3 names on a fresh sheet of paper in pencil. Percival, Vera, Everett. And I put a question mark next to 2 of them and a dash next to the third. Then I went out to the barn. Everett Ashby's blue Ford pickup was in my driveway the next morning at 6:12. I was standing at the fence line. He had not knocked. He had not rung the bell. He was standing at the fence line with his mug in his hand and his hat on, and he was looking at the 400-foot line of vessels, the way a man looks at something he already understands but does not want to. I walked out to him. I did not speak first. He said, Sylvie. I said, Everett. He said, Vaughn Trumbull came to see you last night. I said, how did you know? He said, because his tail lights went past my mailbox at 6:37, and there is nothing north of my mailbox on Ridge Road except your driveway and the state line. I said, you are watching him. He said, I am watching everything. I said, why? He said, because I promised your grandfather I would. I said, when did you promise him that? He said, the week before he died, in the barn. He knew Sylvie. He knew his heart was going. He had been to Dartmouth Hitchcock in January. He came home with a bottle of nitro tablets, and he did not tell anybody except me. He said, Everett, if I do not get to April, you have to be the one who stands at the fence line until she is ready to see me. He said, do not knock, do not talk, just stand at the fence. I said, so that is what you have been doing? He said, that is what I have been doing. I said, Everett. He said, do not apologize. I said, Everett, I owe you an apology in 4 months. He said, you owe me one Nordquist churn and half an hour of your time. I said, which one? He said, the one with the false bottom, that you already opened. I want to see the seal on the bottle. I looked at him. He looked at me. He said, Sylvie, I know, because your grandmother's brother was my first cousin. My mother was a Nordquist. I know exactly what is in that barn. I have known for 46 years. I put my hand over my mouth. I said, Everett. He said, yes. I said, so Von Trumbull. He said, Von Trumbull does not know from me. I said, then from who? He looked at the ground for a long moment. Then he said one sentence. I said, Sylvie, your father worked at Northeast Kingdom Insurance from 1993 to 1995. Von Trumbull was his supervisor. Your father, 16 years after leaving this farm, still drank once a month at the Marconi Tavern in Burlington. And once a month he told a story. I closed my eyes. I said, he told him. Everett said, he told him some of it. Not all. Enough. I said, why? He said, that is your father's to tell. 3 times, in 3 days, from 3 different people. I stood at the fence with my hand over my mouth, and I understood that I was going to have to drive to Burlington. I did not want to drive to Burlington. I did not drive to Burlington. Not yet. Instead, I did the thing Everett had asked me to do. I walked him into the workshop. I lit the lantern. I set churn number 43 on the low bench. I showed him the false bottom. He picked up the green glass bottle with hands that had held bottles like it before. He turned it, read the wax seal, read the stamped die on the false compartment, ERR 1929. He set the bottle down very slowly. He said, that is not your grandfather. I said, what? He said, Ephraim Ross Renwick was born in 1925. He was 4 years old in 1929. He did not seal that bottle. I said, then who? He said his father, also Ephraim Reuben Renwick, died in a barn fire in 1946 when your grandfather was 21. Same initials, same stamp die, passed down to the son, who never explained to anyone that the stamp was not his. I said, there is another generation. He said, there is another generation. I said, Everett. He said, Sylvie, there are 3 families in this valley whose churns went to the co-op auction. Renwick, Nordquist, and Ashby, my family. We stopped in the mid-1940s. Your grandmother's family stopped in the mid-1940s, but your grandfather's father did not stop. He kept going until the barn burned in 1946. And your grandfather spent 46 years buying back everything his father had ever put out into the world because he did not want any of it found by anybody else. And I have been standing at fence lines for 6 weeks because he asked me to. I am telling you now because Von Trumbull is going to come back on Friday at 5 with a wire transfer form in his clipboard, and if he gets his hands on those 118 churns, he will pour the contents down a drain, and he will sell the empty shells for scrap, and he will make sure nothing that could embarrass anybody in Montpelier ever sees daylight, and your grandfather will have died for nothing. I said, why would Von Trumbull do that? He said because in 1988, his father was the sheriff of Orleans County. And in 1988, there was a raid on a barn in Ennisburg Falls. And in 1988, 2 men went to Windsor for 3 years each. One of them was a Nordquist, and one of them was an Ashby. The man who tipped the sheriff was a young insurance clerk in Burlington who thought he was cleaning up a family disgrace and did not understand that he was helping a Trumbull make his name. I sat down on the low bench. I said, my father. Everett said, your father, twice. Once in 1971, once in 1988. He tipped the same family twice, 17 years apart. And the second time it sent my uncle and Elon's brother to prison, and my uncle was 63 years old, and he did not come out. The barn was very quiet. I did not speak. Everett did not speak. After a long time, I said, Everett. He said, yes. I said, why did you not tell my grandfather? He said, because your grandfather already knew. Since 1988. He never spoke to your father again after 1988, except once. Last October. In this barn. That was the last time they spoke. I said he was going to tell me this April. Everett said he was going to tell you this April. I said, Everett. He said, yes. I said, the court hearing is May 14th. He said, I know. I said, my father is going to walk into that courtroom and he is going to try to take enough of this farm to make me sell what is in that barn. He said, I do not know if that is what he is going to do. I know what Von Trumbull thinks he is going to do. I said, and Von Trumbull is going to be sitting in the gallery. He said, almost certainly. I said, and if I lose everything. If I sell to Vaughn, I lose everything else. If I win, I still have to walk out of that courtroom and drive home past my father in the parking lot, and I do not know what my face is going to do. Everett put his hand on my shoulder. He did not squeeze. He placed, the way a father does, the way I understood in that moment a father was supposed to. He said, Sylvie. I said, what? He said, you do not have to walk into that courtroom alone. I said, I do not have anybody. He said, you have Cordelia Whitworth in St. Johnsbury. She has been waiting for your call for 3 weeks. Your grandfather wrote her name and phone number in the last logbook. She is 72 years old. She has appraised private collections in 9 states. She retired in 1997. She reopened her practice last month for exactly 1 client, and she is waiting for you to be ready to pick up the phone. I said, how do you know? He said, because she calls me every Thursday to ask if you have called her yet. I closed my eyes. I said, Everett. He said, Sylvie. I said, I have been a fool. He said, you have been 24. I said, those are not the same thing. He said, in Orleans County, they are close enough. Then he took his hat off and set it on the workbench, and he sat down on the low bench next to me, and he did not say anything else for a long time. I did not cry. I did not cry because the barn is not the place for it, but I did put my face in my hands for the length of 10 breaths. When I took my hands away, Everett had picked up churn number 43, and he had set the false bottom back into it, and he had put the green glass bottle back into the false bottom, and he had closed the whole thing up the way it had been. He had unfolded my grandfather's brass folding rule and laid it across the top of the churn like a bar across a door. He said, nobody opens this again until you say. I said, all right. He said, call Cordelia. I said, all right. He said, do it now. I nodded once. I stood up. I walked into the kitchen. I picked up the black rotary phone. I dialed the number Everett had written on a scrap of paper with a pencil stub he had pulled from behind his ear. A woman answered on the second ring. She said, Cordelia Whitworth. I said, this is Sylvie Renwick, Ephraim's granddaughter. There was a pause on the line. Then Cordelia Whitworth said, I have been waiting for this call since March 8th. I said, I know. She said, it is April 29th. I said, I know. She said, Miss Renwick. I said, Sylvie. She said, Sylvie, do you know why your grandfather chose me? I said, no. She said, because I appraised the estate of the last surviving Nordquist in 1994, and I found what your grandfather had been looking for 40 years, and I did not tell anybody, and I called him and I said, Ephraim, they exist. And he said, I know, I have 23 of them. And we sat in my kitchen for 6 hours, and we did not speak of it to anybody else for 10 years. I said, Cordelia. She said, yes. I said, I need you to drive up here. She said, I am already packed. When? I said, now. She said, I will be there by 4. Then she hung up. I stood in the kitchen with the receiver in my hand, and I looked out the window at the barn, and I saw Everett walking slow across the yard with his hat back on and his mug in his hand and his blue Ford pickup waiting with the driver's door open. And I understood that I had spent 4 months refusing help from the one person who had been standing at my fence line every morning at 6:12 for a reason I had not been ready to hear. I understood that pride is a kind of debt. Some debts get paid in apology, some in 4 months of your life. some in a hearing on the 14th of May in the Orleans County Superior Court. I was going to pay all three. Cordelia Whitworth arrived at 4:12. Silver gray hair, tortoiseshell reading glasses, a leather satchel that had been her mother's, a wool coat that had been her mother's, a pair of soft cotton gloves for handling old wood. She parked her Subaru in the yard next to Everett's pickup, and she got out and she walked straight to the fence line without stopping to greet me. And she stood in front of the row of Nordquist churns with her hands clasped behind her back, the way a woman stands when she is looking at something she has been looking for her whole life. She said one word. Oh, just that, low in her throat. I stood beside her in the olive green coat, and I understood that this syllable was going to matter more than once in my life. I understood that somewhere down the years, there would be another woman in another wool coat saying it in another barn for a reason I would not have to explain, because by then I would already know. I understood that this was the first time, and that first times are what you get to keep. Cordelia stayed for 8 days. She slept in the guest bedroom upstairs. She woke at 5:30. She drank her coffee standing up in the kitchen. Then she went out to the workshop and she looked at churns for 10 hours a day, and she wrote in a leather notebook of her own in a fine spidery hand that I could barely read. And at supper, she would sit across from me at the pine table, and she would tell me the difference between a Nordquist with a maple leaf and a Nordquist without, and how the leaf was stamped only on churns ordered by families on the arrangement, and how the count in the world of surviving Nordquist maple leaf churns was before this week believed to be 11. Not 118, 11. She typed the affidavit on the 8th night on a portable typewriter she had brought in the Subaru. 3 pages, every fact her own, every certification her own, every stamp she had ever appraised in 9 states cross-referenced. It said in careful language that the lot on the Renwick property represented the single largest concentration of intact Nordquist heritage vessels in the surviving record, and that their disposition was a matter of state and possibly national historical significance. She did not mention the false bottoms. Not once. She said, that belongs to your grandfather's letter, and it belongs to your father, not to a court. I said, Cordelia. She said, Sylvie, some parts of a story are not owed to a judge. Learn that now. Merritt Boone of the Vermont Agricultural Historical Society walked into my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in early May, carrying a manila folder tied with a red string. 71 years old, brown corduroy jacket, wire-rimmed glasses. He set the folder on the pine table beside my grandfather's 1954 logbook, and he opened it. Inside was a certified copy of a trust, the Renwick Family Farm Trust of November 7, 1962, recorded and stamped at the Orleans County Registry of Deeds. Irrevocable, naming me Sylvie Ann Renwick, then unborn, as sole heir of the ground and the improvements at 2 and 14 Ridge Road, Orleans County, signed by Ephraim Ross Renwick before witness and notary on the 7th of November, 1962. Which was 2 years before my father turned 11, which was 17 years before I was born. I read the trust 3 times. Then I looked up at Merritt Boone. I said, he wrote this before I existed. Merritt said, he wrote it when your father was 8 years old. He had already decided. I said, about Percival. Merritt said, about Percival. I said, Aunt Vera knew. Merritt said, Vera brought me to your grandfather in 1962. She was 30 when he wrote it. She witnessed. Her signature is on the back. I turned the page. Aunt Vera Louise Renwick in a small, neat hand dated November 7th, 1962. And under that, in a larger hand, in the handwriting of a woman who no longer lived, Elon's brother, Carl Nordquist, notary, Enosburg Falls. The 3 of them in that kitchen in the fall of 1962. Deciding, I did not sleep that night. The night of May 13th, the night before the hearing. I sat at the kitchen table in the olive green barn coat with the brass folding rule on the table beside me, and Cordelia's typed affidavit on my left, and my grandfather's 1954 logbook on my right, and the manila folder in front of me containing the certified trust. I read the trust for the ninth time. Then I closed it. Then I put on my grandfather's coat. Then I walked out to the barn. Churn number 43 sat on the low bench with the brass folding rule across it. I did not open it. I put my hand on the lid and I stood there for a long time. I said out loud, "Tomorrow I'm going to tell the judge everything except what is in this churn. Because everything in this churn belongs to a story that is not for a courtroom, and it never was." And my grandfather knew that in 1962 when he signed a trust in Aunt Vera's kitchen in front of a Nordquist notary who was already dying. And I am going to do it because he asked me to. And I am going to do it because it is my job. And I am going to do it because everything worth keeping was once called scrap by someone in a hurry. The wind came down off the mountain. Somewhere in a hotel room in Burlington, my father was doing whatever a father does. The night before he is going to face a daughter he has not spoken to in 6 years, in a courtroom in the town where he was born. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn. At the bottom of the folder in my own hand in pencil, pressed hard enough to dent the paper, I wrote one line. Tomorrow the story goes into the record. Tomorrow it stops being what nobody could say. Then I closed the folder. Then I put on the coat. Then I walked out to the driveway to wait for Everett Ashby's blue Ford pickup to come up the gravel at 6:12, because he had said he would drive me and he was not going to be a minute late. At 6:12, his headlights turned in. He got out. He walked to the passenger side. He opened the door. He said, "Sylvie." I said, "Everett." He said, "You ready?" I said, "No." He said, "Get in." I got in. We drove down Ridge Road in the pale gray light of a Vermont May morning, 3 days short of full moon, past Aunt Vera's cedar-shingled house, where the light was on in the kitchen, past the Nordquist fence line, where the low sun was just catching the top row of vessels and turning them the color of old nickels, past the mailbox where Von Trumbull's Buick had made a U-turn 7 nights ago, and out onto Route 5 south toward Newport. I put my right hand in my coat pocket. The brass was warm now from an hour of my thumb. I said out loud to nobody in the voice of a woman who had understood that there was no place for it except the passenger seat of a blue Ford pickup driven by a 66-year-old man who had been standing at her fence line every morning for a reason she had not been ready to hear. I said, "All right." Everett did not look at me. He said, "All right," and we drove. The Orleans County Superior Court sits on a corner in Newport, in a red brick building put up in 1886, 3 steps to the door. A brass handle that has been polished by 70 years of the same hands. A courtroom on the second floor with tall windows that face east, so at 8 in the morning on the 14th of May in 2004. The whole room was full of pale yellow light and dust moving slow through it, and it smelled like paper and pine floor polish, and the particular smell of a room where people have said hard things to each other for 118 years. Everett Ashby parked the blue Ford pickup at the curb. He said, "Sylvie." I said, "Everett." He said, "Whatever happens in there today, you did not do it wrong." I said I might. He said, "You did not." Then he took his hat off. He set it on the dashboard. He got out of the truck. I sat there for one more breath. Then I opened the door. The steps up to the courthouse were wet from the morning damp. Cordelia Whitworth was already at the top of them in a slate gray suit and low black heels, her leather satchel in her left hand and her tortoiseshell reading glasses pushed up on her head. Next to her stood Merritt Boone in a brown corduroy jacket he had probably owned since 1979. Aunt Vera was inside. I could see her through the glass door. She was sitting in the second pew in her husband's canvas jacket, with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the floor. I did not see my father yet. I walked up the steps. Cordelia said, "Miss Renwick." I said, "Cordelia." She said, "The affidavit is filed. The trust is authenticated. The photographs are entered as exhibits. Everett walked 3 churns to the courthouse steps himself in his own truck last night at 10. They are in a locked office off the main hall for the judge to view if he requests physical evidence." I said, "Which 3? She said, "Numbers 71, 109, and 114. Not 43. Never 43. That one stays home." I said, "Cordelia." She said, "Yes." I said, "How much?" She looked at Merritt. Merritt said, Miss Renwick, if today goes the way we have prepared for it to go, the Vermont Historical Society will offer $480,000 for the whole lot. 118 churns to be cataloged and stored under the settler's confidentiality conditions. That number is on paper. It is signed. It will be delivered to your attorney by 5 p.m. today, contingent on the outcome of the hearing. I said 480,000. He said for the churns, not for the ground. I said that is more money than my grandfather made in 51 years. He said yes. I said Merritt. He said yes. I said do not say that number out loud in that courtroom. He said I was not going to. Then we went inside. The gallery was fuller than I had expected. Aunt Vera in the second pew, Everett coming in behind me, Cordelia sitting at the plaintiff's table with the Renwick family attorney, a woman named Ines Ostergaard from Newport, whom Ephraim had used for 40 years for the same fee she charged him in 1963 because he had fixed her father's chimney in 1961, and neither of them had ever forgotten. Merritt Boone in the row behind Aunt Vera. In the back of the gallery, third row on the aisle, wearing the charcoal gray suit jacket and the maroon tie, and holding an aluminum clipboard flat against his knees, was Vaughn Trumbull. He nodded at me when I came in. I did not nod back. My father was at the defense table, gray suit, blue shirt, no tie. He had lost weight since the auction. He looked at me once when I walked in. His eyes did not move away, and they did not soften, and they did not harden. He just looked at me, the way a man looks at a photograph of himself at 19, as if he were trying to remember what the face had been thinking. I sat down at the plaintiff's table beside Ines Ostergaard. She said, "You okay?" I said, "No." She said, "Good. That means you are paying attention." Then the bailiff said, "All rise." Judge Talcott McKinnon was 71 years old. He had been on the Orleans County bench since 1979. He had married Ephraim and my grandmother's replacement housekeeper in 1968, and the housekeeper had died in 1994, and he had never remarried. He wore half-rimmed glasses and a black robe. He came in from chambers, sat down, adjusted his glasses, and read the docket. He said, Renwick versus Renwick. Petition for partition and settlement of family trust. Are counsel ready? Ines said, "Ready for the plaintiff, Your Honor." The attorney from Burlington, a man in a dark blue suit with a manila folder and a laptop bag, said, "Ready for the petitioner." Judge McKinnon said, "Mr. Danvers, present your case." The Burlington attorney stood up. His name was Caldwell Danvers. He was 47 years old. He was expensive. My father had paid him something he did not have, because my father had come to court prepared to lose a lot and take a lot at the same time. And I understood that the moment I saw the crease in his suit and the way he did not look at Ines Ostergaard when he stood up. Caldwell Danvers said, "Your Honor, my client Percival Renwick is the only surviving son of the decedent Ephraim Ross Renwick. He is petitioning this court for two forms of relief. First, the enforcement of a family trust settlement of $23,000 established in 1978 upon the death of his grandmother and never dispersed. Second, a partition of the ground and improvements at 214 Ridge Road, Orleans County, in the amount of 1/2 interest in light of the substantial appreciation in Vermont recreational and heritage real estate over the past decade, and in light of my client's status as sole surviving son of the estate." Judge McKinnon said, "Miss Ostergaard." Ines Ostergaard stood up. She said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff's response is straightforward, and it consists of a single document." She held up the manila folder. She said, "The Renwick Family Farm Trust of November 7th, 1962, recorded and stamped at the Orleans County Registry of Deeds, irrevocable, naming the then unborn Sylvie Ann Renwick as sole heir of the ground, the improvements in the personal property contained therein. Signed by Ephraim Ross Renwick before witness and notary on the 7th of November 1962, which was 2 years before my client's client turned 11. The room did not move. Caldwell Danvers said, "Your Honor, my client was not informed of any such trust." Ines Ostergaard said, "Your Honor, My client's client was not required to be informed. The trust was irrevocable. It did not require the consent of any party. It required only the intent of the settlor, which is stated in the trust document itself in the settlor's own hand. She opened the folder. She read aloud. She said, I, Ephraim Ross Renwick, being of sound mind, and considering the future of this ground and this family, do hereby establish this trust for the benefit of my future granddaughter, if any born to any child of mine, upon the following conditions: that the ground and its improvements pass to her upon my death, that the personal property contained therein pass to her upon my death, that no child of mine shall have any claim upon this ground or its contents in life or in death by inheritance or by court, that this decision is made with full knowledge of what it means and full acceptance of the reasons for it. Signed the 7th of November, 1962, Ephraim Ross Renwick. The room was very still. My father did not move. Vaughn Trumbull in the third row did not move. Judge McKinnon adjusted his half-rimmed glasses and read the document for himself. It took him 4 minutes. Then he looked up. He looked at my father first. Then he looked at me. He said, Miss Renwick. I said, yes, Your Honor. He said, did you know about this trust before this hearing was filed? I said, no, Your Honor. He said, when did you learn of it? I said, on the 2nd of May, Your Honor, from Mr. Merritt Boone of the Vermont Agricultural Historical Society, who had come to my house at the recommendation of my Aunt Vera Renwick, and who had received his copy of the trust from the archives of the Vermont Registry, which had been recorded there in 1962. Judge McKinnon said, so this trust was on public record for 42 years. I said, yes, Your Honor. He said, and Mr. Percival Renwick in 42 years never once inquired at the registry. I said that would be a question for Mr. Renwick, Your Honor. Judge McKinnon looked at Caldwell Danvers. Caldwell Danvers cleared his throat. He said, Your Honor, my client's position is that the trust, if valid, was intended for a Sylvie Renwick born to him within an intact marriage. The document refers to a granddaughter born to any child of mine. My client is a child. Miss Renwick was not born within Percival Renwick's marriage, but to a subsequent relationship that ended in divorce, and my client's position is that the trust was intended to apply to a legitimate heir raised on the property, which Miss Renwick was not until age 14. I felt Ines Ostergaard's hand close on my wrist under the table. She did not squeeze. She said quietly, do not answer that. Then she stood up. She said, Your Honor, if Mr. Danvers wishes to argue that the settler's use of the phrase born to any child of mine excludes a child of a subsequent marriage, I would ask the court to consider that in 1962, the word divorce did not appear in Vermont trust law, and that the settler's intent, as read plainly in the document, was to establish a chain of heritage that skipped the intervening generation entirely, which is the entire point of the trust, which is why the settler made it irrevocable, which is why he made it in 1962, 3 years before he had any grandchildren, and did not modify it in the following 42 years despite having ample opportunity. Judge McKinnon said, Miss Ostergaard, do you have any evidence of the settler's intent beyond the document itself? Inez said, yes, Your Honor. I have the settler's 14 personal logbooks kept from 1954 to 2003, which contain in his own hand and pencil, dated and initialed 7 separate references to his intent to leave the farm to a future granddaughter and none of his sons. The relevant pages are marked. The Vermont Historical Society has authenticated the handwriting and the paper stock and the ink. And I have the sworn affidavit of Cordelia Whitworth, retired antiquities appraiser, who will testify to the same effect. She held up the logbooks. She held up the affidavit. She held up the certified copies of the registry stamps. The room did not move. Judge McKinnon read the logbook pages that had been flagged. It took him 11 minutes. Then he looked up. He said, Mr. Danvers. Caldwell Danvers said, Your Honor. Judge McKinnon said, do you have any evidence that Ephraim Ross Renwick at any point in his life revised, revoked, modified, or reconsidered this trust? Caldwell Danvers said, no, Your Honor. Judge McKinnon said, "Do you have any evidence that Ephraim Ross Renwick at any point in his life expressed to any party the intent to leave the farm to his son Percival?" Caldwell Danvers said, "No, Your Honor." Judge McKinnon said, "Do you have any evidence at all beyond the argument that the word grandchild in a 1962 trust document does not apply to a granddaughter born of a subsequent marriage?" Caldwell Danvers said, "No, Your Honor." Judge McKinnon said, "Then this court finds the Renwick Family Farm Trust of November 7th, 1962 to be valid, enforceable, and controlling. The petition for partition is dismissed. The petition for settlement of the 1978 trust is denied on the grounds that no such settlement exists in the records of this court or the Orleans County Registry, and Miss Renwick, as sole heir under the 1962 trust, is under no obligation to satisfy any claim not established in the settler's own documents." He set the papers down. He said, "Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. The room did not move, because none of it had moved for the last 4 minutes. Because we were all sitting in a Vermont courtroom at 10:47 in the morning on the 14th of May, and a 71-year-old judge had just used the word grandchild in a way that made it mean exactly what my grandfather had meant it to mean in 1962. And my father had heard it, and Vaughn Trumbull had heard it, and Aunt Vera had heard it, and Everett had heard it, and I had heard it, and nobody in the room was ready to be the first person to stand up. My father stood up first. He did not look at his attorney. He did not look at Vaughn Trumbull. He walked around the defense table, and he walked past the aisle, and he stopped in front of my table, and he stood there for the length of one breath. He said, "Sylvie." I said nothing. He said, "I need to speak with you, outside, alone, whenever you are ready." I said, "Later." He said, "Whenever you are ready." He walked out. I did not follow him. Not yet. Vaughn Trumbull got up quietly from the third row, and he walked out behind my father. Everett watched him go. Everett said one sentence to nobody in particular. He said, "Trumbull is not done." I said, "I know." Ines Ostergaard was already packing her briefcase. She said, "You have 45 minutes before Merritt calls the society board. Where do you want to have the conversation with your father?" I said, "The barn." She said, "Which one?" I said, "Ephraim's." She said, "All right." Cordelia walked with me out of the courthouse. At the top of the wet steps, she stopped. She said, "Sylvie." I said, "Cordelia." She said, "There is one more thing your grandfather asked me to give you. He gave it to me in 1994 with instructions to hand it to you on the day the trust was upheld and not before." She reached into the leather satchel. She took out an envelope. Thick, cream paper, my name on the front in his pencil hand. She said, "Do not open it in the courthouse. Do not open it in the car. Open it in the barn." He was very specific. I said, "All right." I put the envelope in my coat pocket. Everett drove me home. We did not speak. He parked at the fence line. He said, "Sylvie." I said, "Everett." He said, "I will be at Aunt Vera's. Call when you are done." I said, "All right." He drove down the gravel. My father's car came up the gravel 11 minutes later. He got out. I was carrying a small wooden box under his arm. Cedar, about the size of a bread loaf. Dovetailed corners, older than he was. I met him at the fence line. He said, "Sylvie." I said, "Percival." He said, "Can we do this in the barn?" I said, "Yes." We walked to the barn. He did not look at the row of Nordquists as we passed. He did not look at the workshop door. He looked at his own boots on the ground the whole way. Inside the barn, I lit the lantern. I set it on the workbench. He set the cedar box beside it. He put his hands on the workbench on either side of the box. He looked at the low bench where his father had died with a pencil in his hand 3 months ago. He said, "This is where he died." I said, "Yes." He said, "Coombs told me on the phone." He described it. "I have been picturing it for 6 weeks. It is different in person." I said, "It is." He said, "Sylvie." I said, "Yes." He said, "I told the revenue agent in 1971. I said, "I know." He looked up. He said, "You know." I said, "Everett told me." He nodded, looked down. He said, "Then this is going to go faster than I planned." I said, you had a plan. He said, for 33 years I have had a plan. I said, Percival. He said, yes. I said, tell me why, just the why. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, because I was 17 years old in 1971, and my father had been asking me since I was 14 to help him hide bottles in the barn. I did not know what they were at first. When I found out, I was ashamed. And when I was ashamed, I went to a young revenue officer in St. Johnsbury, who I met at a diner in 1971, and I told him about the barn, and he raided it 2 weeks later, and he found nothing. Because my father had already moved everything. Because my father had known I would talk. Because my father had known me better than I knew me. I said that was 1971. He said that was 1971. I said in 1988. He said in 1988, I was 34 years old and I was working in Burlington and I had a wife I was already losing and I had a daughter who was 8 years old and living with her mother in New Hampshire and asking me every other weekend when I was going to come see her, and I did not have any money. Vaughn Trumbull's father was the Orleans County Sheriff, and Vaughn Trumbull was a young insurance clerk at Northeast Kingdom Insurance in Burlington. He asked me at the Marconi Tavern one night in April what I knew about the Nordquist family. I told him everything I remembered from 1971. 2 months later, there was a raid in Enosburg Falls. Your grandmother's brother went to Windsor. Everett Ashby's uncle went to Windsor. Everett's uncle did not come out. He stopped. His hands were flat on the workbench, and his hands were shaking, and he was looking at his own hands the way you look at somebody else's. He said, I was 34 and stupid and running from the same shame I had run from at 17. When I sobered up 2 days later and understood what I had done, I called my father to warn him. He already knew. He had known since the day I met Vaughn Trumbull. Some friend in Burlington had told him. He said, Percival, do not come back. I do not want you here. You have hurt these families twice now. I do not want you to hurt them 3 times. I said, and you did not come back. He said, and I did not come back. I said, until the auction. He said, until the auction. I said, why did you come to the auction? He said, because Vaughn Trumbull called me 3 weeks after your grandfather died. He said, Percival, your daughter is going to bid on that lot. He said, I know what is in those churns because your father told my father in 1988 after the raid, and the two of them made an arrangement, and my father died 3 years ago and left me nothing but the arrangement, and I want it back. He said, tell your daughter to stand down. I will make sure she is taken care of. I said, no. He said, Percival, I will make sure it looks like she stood down because you told her to. I said no again. And I drove up to the auction and I tried to stop you. Not because I wanted the churns, not because I wanted the money, not because I did not want you to have them. I tried to stop you because I did not want Vaughn Trumbull to have any reason to hurt you the way I had let him hurt your grandmother's family. The lantern burned low. I sat down on the low bench where my grandfather had died. I said, you knew what was in the churns. He said, I knew from age 14. I have known for 36 years. I said, and you never told anybody after 1988. He said, not to a bartender, not to a therapist, not to your mother when she asked me why I would not visit the farm, not to you when you asked me at 11 why Grandpa did not send me a Christmas card, not to anybody, for 16 years. I said, Percival. He said, yes. I said, what is in the box? He looked at the cedar box. He said, this is my apology. He opened the lid. Inside was a logbook, scuffed brown leather, rubber band around it, the rubber gone brittle, the cover soft and dark from years of hands. He said, this is 1954, Volume 1. I said, that book is on my kitchen table. He said, no, that book is Volume 2. This is Volume 1. He kept them both. Volume 1 is the one he was writing in when I was born. I stole it when I was 12 years old. I took it out of the north drawer in 1966. I kept it in my sock drawer until I moved out. I took it with me. I have had it for 38 years. I have never read it. I could not read it. I have known for 38 years that it was not mine. And I have known for 38 years that I could not give it back without saying why I took it. And I have known for 38 years that I could not say why I took it, because saying why I took it would mean saying who I have been. He stopped, swallowed, looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back down at the box. He said, and I am 50 years old, and my father is dead, and my mother is dead, and my sister is not speaking to me, and my daughter has just watched a judge in Newport read my letter to me in front of a room of people who knew me when I was a boy, and I do not have 30 more years to figure out how to say it. He set the logbook on the workbench. He said, read the first page. That is the page I stole it for. I picked up the logbook. I opened. The first page was blank except for one line written in pencil, pressed hard enough to dent the paper in the hand of a man who had been 29 years old and just starting. The line said, my son is born today, May 8, 1954. His name is Percival Ephraim Renwick. He is small. He is loud. His mother thinks he looks like her brother. I hope he does. I hope he is loud his whole life. I hope he says every hard thing that needs to be said. I hope he is braver than I have been. Everything worth keeping was once called scrap by someone in a hurry. Underneath it, in a shakier version of the same pencil hand, my grandfather had added one line. I was wrong about you at 17. I was wrong about you at 34. I have been wrong about you for 16 years. I have not been wrong about you today. Today you gave the book back. Signed, Ephraim. October 12, 2003. I closed the book. I set it on the workbench. I said, Percival. He said, yes. I said, you saw him. He said once, in October, he wrote to me at the insurance office. He said, come to the barn on a Saturday. I have something to say. I drove up. I sat here. I gave him the book. He read the page. He wrote what he wrote. He handed it back. He said, keep it until she is old enough. Give it to her the day she wins. I said, wins what? He said everything. Then he got up and he made coffee and we drank it, and he did not speak of it again, and I did not stay for supper, and I have not been back until today. I said, October. He said, October. I said, that was 5 months before he died. He said, that was 5 months before he died. Neither of us spoke. After a long time, I said, Percival. He said, yes. I said, Von Trumbull. He said, I know. I said, he is not going to stop. He said, he is not going to stop today. He may stop tomorrow. He may stop in a year. He will stop, because I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure he does. Sylvie, I am not asking to be part of this farm. I am not asking to be part of your life. I am asking to be the person in Burlington who makes phone calls when Von Trumbull tries to make them. I am asking to be the person who sits in a courtroom next time and takes the questions I should have taken 16 years ago. I have 23 years of insurance fraud investigation experience, and I have a very clean record, and I have 3 people at the State Attorney General's office who take my calls, and I am telling you that the only thing I have left to give you is that I know exactly how Von Trumbull thinks, and I know exactly what he will do next, and I know how to stop him. I said, Percival. He said, yes. I said, get out of my barn. He nodded. He picked up his hat from the workbench. He walked toward the door. At the door, he stopped. He did not turn around. He said, the book is yours. I already knew that. I brought it in the box because I did not want to hand it to you like it was a thing I had been keeping. I said, Percival. He said, yes. I said, come to Sunday supper at Aunt Vera's next week. He did not move. He said, she invited me. I said, I know. He said, I did not know if you would want me there. I said, I do not know if I want you there. I know I do not want you not there. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he said, all right. Then he walked out. I sat on the low bench in the lantern light for a long time. Then I got up. I went to the workbench. I picked up volume 1. I set it beside volume 2, which Everett had walked into my kitchen with the day before yesterday, and set on the kitchen table without a word. I opened both. I laid them side by side, first page to first page. The same line in both. written 29 years apart. Everything worth keeping was once called scrap by someone in a hurry. I closed them. I put them in the north drawer. Then I took the envelope out of my coat pocket. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of onion skin paper folded 3 times, typed on the flatbed typewriter he had bought used in 1972. It said, "Sylvie, if Cordelia has given you this envelope, then the trust held, and you are the last Renwick who will ever have to prove to a courtroom what you are. I am sorry for that. I did not know how to spare you it. Do not be angry with your father. He was 17 years old once. So was I. So will you be in a way until you die. Everything worth keeping was once called scrap by someone in a hurry, but so are people. And I called scrap on my own son for 16 years, and I got him back for 6 hours in October, and it was worth every one of the 16 years to have had them. Do not wait as long as I did. If you have already forgiven him, do not tell him yet. Let him work for it. He needs the work. It is the only thing that has ever done him any good. And Sylvie, the Nordquist churns, sell them to the Vermont Historical Society. All of them. Do not keep any of them. Do not open the false bottoms. Do not tell anyone what is inside. Merritt Boone will handle it. He has a plan I approved in 1998. The bottles will be cataloged, sealed in temperature-controlled storage, and never opened in your lifetime or his. They belong to a story that is not ours to end. Grandma's people made them. Grandma's people would want them kept. That is all. I love you. I have loved you since you were 4 years old, and put your hand on the brass rule in my pocket and asked me what it was. That is the day I decided to leave you the farm. That is the day I wrote the trust in my head. I wrote it on paper 8 days later. Take care of the barn. Take care of your father. Take care of yourself. Grandpa. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it back into its creases. I put it in the north drawer with the 2 logbooks. I closed the drawer. I put on my grandfather's coat. I walked out to Aunt Vera's. Merritt Boone signed the papers at Aunt Vera's kitchen table at 4:17 that afternoon. The offer was $480,000 for the whole Nordquist lot. 118 churns to be cataloged and stored by the Vermont Historical Society under conditions specified by the settler of a private family trust, said conditions to remain confidential in perpetuity. The check was cut against the Society's endowment fund. Cordelia witnessed the signature. Aunt Vera made a pot of coffee. Nobody drank it. Vaughn Trumbull came up my gravel driveway at 6:41 that evening. He got out of the Buick. He was carrying the aluminum clipboard. He walked to the porch. He rang the bell. I opened the door. He said, "Miss Renwick." I said, "Vaughn." He said, "I heard about the sale." I said, "It is a small county." He said, "Miss Renwick, I want to make you an offer." I said, "No." He said, "I have not made it yet." I said, "You do not need to. Percival called me at 5. He said you would be here at 6:30. You are 11 minutes late. That is because you stopped at the diner in West Glover to have coffee and to think about your delivery." It did not help. His face did not change, but something behind it did. I said, "And I do not need distribution. I do not need advice. I do not need warning. I do not need help. I do not need anything you have. Not now, not tomorrow, not ever. You worked with my father in 1993. You knew what was in that barn since 1988. You wanted it for yourself. You waited 16 years. You lost. Go home." He said, "Miss Renwick, you do not understand what I could still do." I said, "I understand exactly what you could do. You could file complaints with the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation and with the County Health Board and with the State Tax Authority. You could make my life difficult for the next 3 years in ways that would cost me money and time. You could try to have the trust challenged on some ground you have not yet thought of. I understand all of it, and I am telling you that my father spent 16 years learning exactly how men like you operate. And he has spent the last 4 hours on the phone with the Attorney General's office in Montpellier. If you take one step down my gravel driveway again in the next 20 years, you are going to spend the rest of your life explaining to a room full of very tired public servants exactly what your father did in Enosburg Falls in 1988 and what you did about it and what you have been doing about it ever since. I am telling you this on the porch, in person, without a lawyer, because I want you to remember my voice. Vaughn Trumbull looked at me for a long moment. The rimless glasses caught the last of the evening sun. He tried that patient little smile, except it did not work anymore. Because a man's face can do a thing 1,000 times, and one day it stops working, and he does not know it. And everybody watching him knows it. And there is nothing crueler in the world than the moment a man discovers his face has stopped working, and he is the last one to find out. He said, Miss Renwick. I said, go home, Vaughn. He said, you will not always be 24. I said, you will always be Vaughn Trumbull. He turned. He walked back to the Buick. He got in. He drove down the gravel. He did not look back. I closed the door. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then I sat down at the table with the coffee that had gone cold and the check for $480,000 folded in the front pocket of my grandfather's coat, and the envelope from Cordelia in the north drawer, and the 2 logbooks in the north drawer, and the brass folding rule in my right coat pocket. And I understood that the 14th of May 2004 was already almost over, and that the person walking into the kitchen tomorrow to make coffee was not going to be the same person who had walked out of it that morning. I did not cry, not tonight. Tonight was for sitting. The Northeast Kingdom Dairy Cooperative filed for bankruptcy in March of 2007. I bought the cinderblock warehouse building outside Newport at auction in May for $12,400, which was the exact price of the tractor I had rented in 2004 to haul my first load of churns home. I had the drain trenches capped, the fluorescent tubes pulled out, and skylights cut into the roof. Northern light all day. Free. 12 benches. A rack for staves sorted by species. Over the door, mounted on a piece of white oak, I shaped myself. My grandfather's brass folding rule hung in a shadow box until the day I decided a tool in a box is a dead tool, and I put it back in my right coat pocket where it belonged. Vaughn Trumbull moved to Concord, New Hampshire in 2005. He sold equipment leases for a dealer of dairy processing plants until 2011, when the dealer went out of business. After that, I heard he was doing something with real estate. He never called, he never wrote, he never came to Vermont again. The last person to see him was Everett's cousin at a gas station in Lebanon in 2013. He was buying a bag of chips. He looked older. Everett's cousin did not say hello. Percival came to Sunday supper at Aunt Vera's for the rest of her life. He came every week. He was almost always late. He brought a loaf of bread from a bakery in Burlington that Aunt Vera did not like, and Aunt Vera ate it anyway, and neither of them ever admitted the truth about the bread, and I do not think either of them wanted to. I sat at that table for 11 years. Sometimes I said nothing to my father for an entire meal. Sometimes I asked him about work. Once in the fall of 2009, I asked him if he had ever loved my mother, and he said yes, in the way you can love a person you are already lying to. And I did not ask him about my mother again. He earned the answer slowly. That was the arrangement. Aunt Vera lived until 2004. She died at 82 in her sleep, in her own bed, in the cedar shingled house at the end of the dirt road 3 miles up from the state line. Percival was in the kitchen making coffee when she went. She had asked him for coffee at 6. He had said 5 minutes. She had said, take your time. When he came in with the cup, she had already gone. He set the cup on the nightstand. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. He did not call anybody for 2 hours. Then he called me. He said, Sylvie. I said, I know. He said, how did you know? I said, because you called at 9:10 on a Tuesday, and you only call on Sundays. He said, she just went. I said, I know. He said, she had coffee waiting for me. I said, she would. He said, Sylvie. I said, Percival. He said, I am 60 years old, and my father is dead, and my mother is dead, and my sister is dead, and I am trying to remember what I was supposed to do next, and I cannot. I said, you are supposed to call the funeral home, and you are supposed to open the windows, and you are supposed to sit with her until they come. I am on my way. I will be there in 40 minutes. You are not doing any of this alone. He said, all right. I hung up. I drove to Aunt Vera's. I was sitting on the edge of the bed when I came in. He had opened the windows. The cup of coffee was on the nightstand. He had folded her hands over her canvas jacket, which she had asked to be buried in. I sat next to him. I did not speak. We sat for a long time. Everett Ashby's blue Ford pickup came up the dirt road at 10:17 because Percival had called him third. The three of us sat with Aunt Vera until the funeral home came at 11. At the graveside a week later, my father stood on my left and Everett stood on my right, and the preacher used the word rest 4 times, and I squeezed the brass folding rule in my coat pocket 4 times. Percival did not cry where anyone could see it. Everett did not cry at all. I did not cry until I got home to the barn that night, and I sat on the low bench where my grandfather had died with the pencil in his hand, and then I cried for about 11 minutes, and then I stopped. Because the barn was the place for it after all. Turns out he had been wrong about that one thing. Juna Blackwood came up my gravel road in the autumn of 2018. She was 22 years old. She had just graduated from UVM with a degree in vintage material culture. She had a beat-up Honda and a duffel bag and a Nordquist churn in the trunk that she had bought at an estate sale in Enosburg Falls for $11 because the family had thought it was junk. She had read Merritt Boone's monograph on Vermont dairy heritage vessels. She had underlined most of it. She had come to ask if she could work for me for a summer. I hired her the same afternoon. She stayed 4 years. She learned to read maker's marks. She learned to warm the tin with a heat lamp until it was blood temperature, and then tap it, then rest it, then tap it again. She learned that if you strike within 1.5 inches of a crimp, the crimp has no give, and the seam will let go. She learned that some of what looks like damage is the armor keeping the thing alive. She split her first 11 lids wrong. She overheated hide glue once. She cried in the shop 3 times in her first year once, in the second, and never again. She learned when to speak in the barn and when not to. She learned that the kitchen was the place for the crying if the barn would not do. Beatrix Ferndale came in the spring of 2008. She had heard about the Nordquist sale from Cordelia. She had spent 3 years quietly buying up every non-Nordquist churn I restored and could not place. Galloway's Ashen and Sons, the plain Vermont bodies. She sold them to museums and to private collectors in Boston and Providence and New Haven, and she never once asked what had happened to the ones I had not put on the market. She drove up on a Tuesday morning in April. Silver gray hair pulled into a low twisted bun. Round tortoiseshell reading glasses pushed up on her head. Rust-colored wool coat, cream turtleneck, underneath black wide-leg trousers, flat black boots. She got out of a Volvo that was the exact color of a stone that had sat in a river for a long time. She walked into the hay barn where I had 700 non-Nordquist churns stacked 4 high on pallets I had built myself out of pine slabs from Everett's woodlot. Restored, cleaned, numbered, ready to move. She set the loop on its black cord and did not say a word for the space of 10 breaths. I counted them. She said one word. Oh, just that. She said, there is nothing like this east of the Mississippi. I said, I know. She said, you knew when you started. I said, I did not know. She said, then when? I said, when my aunt taught me to read a stamp. When my grandfather taught me to hold a folding rule. When a man named Everett Ashby stood at my fence line every morning at 6:12 for 6 weeks and did not knock. Somewhere in there. She said, how much do you want for the room? I said, not yet. She said, Sylvie. I said, Beatrix, not yet. Come back in the fall. There will be more. She said, all right. She stayed for tea. She looked at 3 churns. She left. She came back every October for the next 14 years, and I sold her whatever I wanted to sell that year, and I kept whatever I wanted to keep, and she never once tried to change my mind on either. That was the sound of the world catching up. It never apologized. It just said, oh. On a Tuesday morning in October 2022, I put on my grandfather's coat, which was now my coat and had been my coat for 18 years. I walked out to the workshop where Juna was tapping a Peerless of Detroit with a wooden dolly and a maple mallet. I stood in the doorway until she looked up. I said, Juna. She said, Sylvie. I said, set that down for a minute. She set it down. I walked to the workbench. I took the brass folding rule out of my right coat pocket. The corner's still bright. I set it on the bench between us. I picked up the two logbooks from the shelf, Volume 1 and Volume 2. The rubber bands both replaced, now the leather oiled every spring by hands that were not Ephraim's and not Percival's, and no longer even entirely mine. I set them beside the rule. I said he never got to finish it. Juna said, I know. I said, neither will you. She said, I know. I said, that is the job. Juna's fingers closed around the brass. She did not thank me. She did not need to. She said everything worth keeping was once called scrap by someone in a hurry. I said yes. Then I walked out to check the west hedgerow. I left her to it. My father is 68 years old this year. He still lives in Burlington. He still comes for Sunday supper, only now it is at my kitchen table, and he still brings the wrong bread. He does not eat much. He walks with a slight limp on the left side from a fall in his own kitchen in 2019 that he did not tell me about for 11 days. 2 weeks ago, he called me on a Thursday. He said, Sylvie. I said, Percival. He said, I put you on the account at the credit union. You are the only signature. I said, I know. You told me in 2011. He said, I know. I am telling you again. I said, all right. He said, Sylvie. I said, yes. He said, I forgave you a long time ago for not calling me in 1998. I said, I forgave you a long time ago for not answering when I did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, see you Sunday. I said, see you Sunday. Then he hung up. That is what a forgiven thing sounds like. It sounds like a Thursday phone call about a credit union account and the exact number of steps between two people who spent 30 years not walking them. Look around your own place sometime. The pile out back, the box in the attic, the person at the table who has not spoken your name in 20 years, the father you did not call, the daughter you have not called, the letter you did not open, the bottle you did not pour out, the trust you did not read, the 3 names on a sheet of paper with a question mark next to 2 of them and a dash next to the one you had misread. It might not be junk, it might be waiting, it might be your turn. And whoever it was who called it scrap first, they were in a hurry. You do not have to be.